Welcome to the Bogosity podcast for the 12th of September 2011, the podcast that replaces your golf balls with raw eggs. This is your host, Shane Killian. First, a brief correction. Last week we said the biggest Bogon emitter, Warren Buffett, was nominated by Fletch for Freedom. In fact, Fletch for Freedom seconded the nomination of Dave Turcotte. We apologize for the error. We have just passed the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. This should be a good time to go back and reflect on that great tragedy, what it means, and where we should go from here. Unfortunately, so many people are using it as a platform for their opinion on separation of church and state, on both sides. The real lessons of 9/11 once more go unlearned. The lessons of 9/11 go to the unintended consequences of our foreign policy, as every intelligence expert has concluded, but politicians continue to ignore and deny. They just don't want to admit that our meddling in foreign affairs, our sending the military to police the world and topple governments and kill thousands of foreigners, just might not be welcomed with open arms by some. What's worse is there seems to be a feedback loop. Supposedly we have to go over there to teach these terrorists a lesson. For example, Reagan bombed Libya to teach Gaddafi a lesson. Shortly afterwards, Libyan terrorists destroyed a TWA plane over Lockerbie, Scotland. It seems that the lesson just doesn't get learned. Instead, it results in even more violence, which causes us to go over there again to try to teach another lesson, with similar results. Our so-called leaders whine and moan about what a cowardly act the 9/11 attack was. Well, it was certainly an insane act, a despicable act, and a horrendous act, but the truth is, it was anything but cowardly. Certainly not as cowardly as the president ordering the bombings of foreigners, while he himself was completely safe, not having to face any danger, not even so much as real accountability for his actions. And by the president, I'm referring to Barack Obama, and George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton, and George H.W. Bush, and Ronald Reagan, and, well, I'd better stop before I use up all my time. Oh, if only someone had had the foresight to warn us ahead of time that something like this would happen. Oh, wait! Someone did! It was none other than the late, great Harry Browne in an interview on C-SPAN on July 3rd, 2000, the day after he received the Libertarian Party's nomination for president.
And of course, we've been bombing countries around the world. It's no wonder that terrorists are trying to attack our country. They don't like our foreign policy. They don't like the idea that we are running their countries, and they want to influence our foreign policy. And the only way they know how to do that is by blowing up the World Trade Center or whatever. If we would simply butt out of other countries' affairs, then other countries would be much less anxious to come over here and try to terrorize us. The problem today is that we don't have much of a national defense. We can't protect this country against any two-bit dictator who gets his hands on a nuclear missile. What we do have is a giant national offense. We have the ability to annihilate any country in the world. We have troops in almost 100 countries of the world as though we were the occupying Roman army. We have bullied other countries into coming to Washington and agreeing to settlements that the President of the United States thinks is good.
Every time something like this happens, we're asked to give up more of our precious liberties. We're told we need to do this because the terrorists hate us for our freedom and want to take it away from us. But what sense does this make? It's like saying people hate you for being so rich, so you need to burn all your money to stop them from destroying it. And then, of course, there are all the lies they tell us to get into war, like so-and-so has weapons of mass destruction to use against us, or is harboring terrorists, or whatever. These lies are well documented. The website truthaboutwar.org documented all of the publicly available information about Iraq and Saddam Hussein before the Iraq War started to show that there just wasn't any reason to believe that Saddam had these weapons or any ties to Al-Qaeda or any other terrorists. On the day the Iraq War started, they froze the site, and with the exception of a couple of articles, which are clearly labeled, no additions have been made since then. The site represents the information that was publicly available the day the Iraq War started. So when Democrats and other people who supported the war wholeheartedly tell you they were misled, that there was no way they could have known, you'll know not to take that seriously either. All the wars in my life I have been against. The Vietnam War, Cambodia, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Grenada, the Persian Gulf, Panama, Bosnia, Somalia, I've been against them all. And I'm against the current wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. And I'll save you the suspense. The next war the Democrats and Republicans get us into, I'm already against it. Because I know that it will be based on lies, just as all the others were. I'll know not to believe them when they say that whatever country has weapons of mass destruction, because they lied about that in Iraq. I'll know not to believe them when they say that country's leader is a more dangerous tyrant than all the dangerous tyrants in all the other countries we're not invading. That he's not really the next Hitler, because they said that about Slobodan Milosevic, Saddam Hussein, and Muammar Gaddafi. And most of all, I'll know not to believe them when they talk about the threat of terrorism. Because I know that terrorism is inspired and encouraged by these foreign wars and occupations, killing people, destroying property, generating hate and resentment. Because people predicted that, and they were right, whereas the predictions of warmongers have been wrong time and time again. That is the lesson we should learn from 9/11. That is the lesson we should take with us as we move on into the 21st century, and once again make this country a beacon of liberty unto the world, creating free countries and toppling dictators not through arms, because that never works, but through leading by example. Back when America did that, we inspired rebellions and freedom movements all over the world without having to send a single soldier. That is what America must become again, for our sake and the sake of all the people of the world. Now let's stuff loads of toilet paper down the news of the bogus. An archivist at the State Department has uncovered documents from the 1950s showing that, get this, the feds believed in the Yeti, that's the abominable snowman, and actually passed regulations about its capture. I would accuse them of watching too much Doctor Who, except that Doctor Who wasn't on the air yet. That plus the fact that there's no such thing as too much Doctor Who. The State Department set 3 rules for the Yeti hunters. First, you need a permit from the government of Nepal to hunt imaginary mythical beings. I'm sure unicorn and leprechaun permits weren't far behind. Second, quote, it must not be killed or shot at except in an emergency arising out of self-defense. And third, quote, news and reports throwing light on the actual existence of the creature must be submitted to the government of Nepal as soon as they are available and must not in any way be given out to the press or reporters for publicity without the permission of the government of Nepal. You know, I would complain about the violation of freedom of the press here, but since the Yeti is mythical anyway, I guess this is only a mythical violation. What I want to know is, where's our treaty with Mexico covering the search for the chupacabra? The espionage case continues against WikiLeaks, which has been under attack recently for actually acting like a free press. The grand jury indicting WikiLeaks has made a request under the PATRIOT Act for information held by their DNS provider, Dynadot. The list of information demanded includes usernames and other identification of subscribers to WikiLeaks, mailing addresses, residential and business addresses, emails, connection times, IP addresses, and any related communications. Folks, this smacks of a blatant attempt to harass those who participated in WikiLeaks and read anything on the site, regardless of whether or not it had anything to do with the current case. But the current case is a hideous joke anyway, and not a very funny one. WikiLeaks has come under investigation for doing nothing more than what the press was supposed to have done, released information about what our government has been up to and how many American lives have been destroyed by our insane foreign policy. They're indicting WikiLeaks under the convoluted and unconstitutional 1917 Espionage Act. This act made it illegal to dispense information which would interfere with the U.S. military's operations abroad or promote any successes made by its enemies. In other words, it blatantly violated freedom of speech and of the press and made it a crime punishable by 30 years in prison or even death. It also made it illegal to make any statements that would cause disloyalty in the military or obstruct the enlistment service, punishable by up to 20 years in prison or a $100,000 fine. Appallingly, the Supreme Court upheld this hideous debasement of our basic liberties in Schenck v. United States. This case happened after Charles Schenck was convicted for printing leaflets in protest of the draft. In blatant violation of his free speech rights, he was arrested and convicted, and the court upheld its conviction. This is actually the case where Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. made the famous statement, "The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic." So yes, if you've used that phrase to justify some kind of government infringement of our rights, you've used the phrase of someone making an excuse to stop someone from protesting the military draft. Congratulations. Feel good about yourself. This argument was actually nullified in Brandenburg v. Ohio. Here, the Supreme Court narrowed the scope of not only Schenck, but also other decisions as well, stating that 2 requirements must be in place in order for speech to be considered a clear and present danger. 1. The speech must not only attempt to incite others to lawless action, but be effective in doing so. And 2. The lawless action being incited must constitute an imminent threat. This is now known as the imminent lawless action test. Holmes himself doubted the Schenck decision later on when free speech activists greatly criticized it. This resulted in him siding with the minority in Abrams v. United States, where a man was deported for distributing flyers, saying the U.S. should not interfere in the Russian Revolution. In any event, it's difficult to see how this could possibly apply to WikiLeaks, but here's an even funnier thing. If WikiLeaks violated the Espionage Act, so has the New York Times, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, and El País. Because all of them released the classified cables while working with WikiLeaks to do so. In fact, the New York Times published them before WikiLeaks did. The fact that the feds are going after WikiLeaks, but not the Times, smacks of selective prosecution. It's really simple. The government doesn't like press that they can't control. They never have. WikiLeaks is seen as a loose cannon, someone who won't play ball, even though WikiLeaks did give the White House the opportunity to examine the documents and request redactions, and they refused to even respond. Our government simply doesn't like the fact that WikiLeaks has so easily shown their incompetence and corruption and are staging an obvious witch hunt. But make no mistakes, WikiLeaks has the same right to freedom of the press protections as anybody. Freedom of the press was never meant to apply to an elite cadre of organizations and corporations who could convince the government to give them press IDs. According to the Constitution, all of us are the press, whether we have a newspaper, a blog, a YouTube channel, or a wiki. The actions of WikiLeaks should send 2 messages. 1 to the government. People will expose your corruption and your incompetence, so you'd better shape up. And the other to the press. Do your job, or the hackers will do it for you. Despite all the political rhetoric about how we need the government to step in when there's a disaster, otherwise who's going to help these people, FEMA faces enormous funding issues, and when it does respond, it generally responds so late that they aren't much help at all. Oftentimes they get in the way of actual help that is coming from private sources. But many companies, including the big box retailers like Walmart and Home Depot, are already ready. They have hundreds of trucks filled with supplies such as plywood and non-perishable food deployed in areas at risk of hurricane damage, and have been since over a week before Irene hit. Home Depot even has a hurricane command center where associates look at meteorological predictions and determine ahead of time where these supplies are most likely to be needed. Beginning months before hurricane season, they looked at what the different stores in hurricane-prone areas were stocking and trying to predict what might be needed should a hurricane hit. When Irene hit Puerto Rico, Home Depot had hit their emergency generators and opened to anyone who needed the supplies. Same with Walmart. Almost immediately after Irene passed through, Walmart stores were open and servicing the needs of everyone in the area. After Hurricane Katrina, Walmart was in there a week after the levees broke, thanks to a staff meteorologist they have at Walmart headquarters. While the politicians were still determining which platitudes they should be giving the news media, Walmart had supplies out in their parking lots, giving away supplies to the community. They even raided their own pharmacies to give drugs to local hospitals that needed them, whereas FEMA was slow to act and ineffective at helping, even hindering the efforts of Walmart and other companies trying to get much-needed aid and supplies to the area. According to a report from the Department of Homeland Security, these criticisms of FEMA are warranted. The report found that FEMA was unprepared, incurred enormously high costs, incompetent at managing the tracking of supplies, and incapable of working with local authorities. Now, to add insult to injury, FEMA is demanding that hurricane victims pay a lot of the money back. The facts make it plain. The more we rely on the private sector to handle disasters, the better off we are. The more we rely on government, the worse off the victims are. And now it's time to hold back the dry heaves from this week's biggest Bogon emitter. Creation Today is a weekly broadcast from Creation Science Evangelism hosted by Eric Hovind, son of convicted fraudster Kent Hovind, which goes just about how you'd think. Young Earth creationists misuse science and lie about scientists to try and support their Bogosity. But recently they stepped up their Bogon emissions to radioactive levels when they had the audacity to accuse Penn Jillette of Penn and Teller of, well, just hear it for yourself.
Now, there's a fellow who actually, Christians and churches ask permission to post his video in their churches. And he's telling people that there is no God. Now, you'd think that would be a great trick, wouldn't you?
That'd be a really good trick.
Well, Eric, I give you Penn Jillette.
That's exactly what he's done.
There is just nothing about this that is true. First of all, none of these churches got permission from either Penn Jillette or from Sony, the company that produced and owns the Penn Says videos, to play them in their churches. They did it entirely on their own. Second, he didn't do any kind of trick or anything devious or nefarious. All he did was recount a story of someone who gave him a Bible. Hear it for yourself.
I get home from the show, and at the end of the show, as I've mentioned before, we go out and we talk to folks, and there was one guy waiting over to the side in the what I call the hover position, and he handed me a Gideon Pocket Edition. He said, I wrote in the front of it, and I wanted you to have this. It was really wonderful. I believe he knew that I was an atheist. And he was truly complimentary. It wasn't in any way, it didn't seem like empty flattery. And I've always said, that I don't respect people who don't proselytize. I don't respect that at all. If you believe that there's a heaven and hell, and people could be going to hell, or not getting eternal life, or whatever, and atheists who think that people shouldn't proselytize, just leave me alone, keep your religion to yourself. How much do you have to hate somebody to not proselytize? I mean, if I believed, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that a truck was coming at you, and you didn't believe it, that truck was bearing down on you, there's a certain point where I tackle you. And this is more important than that. Now, I know there's no God, and one polite person living his life right doesn't change that. But I'll tell you, he was a very, very, very good man. And with that kind of goodness, it's okay to have that deep of a disagreement. I still think that religion does a lot of bad stuff, but man, that was a good man who gave you that book. That's all I wanted to say.
But that's not the story you get from Hovind and Company.
In the video, he professes his atheism and says, I know there is no God.
That's right, and Christians are being duped. I think this is his greatest trick. Because first of all, what he's saying is that there is no God, and of course we've discussed on the show previously that everybody knows that God exists.
That's exactly right.
And in other respect, too, I think it's kind of patronizing.
What? It's patronizing to appreciate a gift someone gave you out of sincerity? We won't even get into the long-refuted everybody knows God exists Bogosity, but it's clear that it's these guys, not Penn, who are playing the tricks and duping Christians.
He's getting this message into churches. And I watched a video later on where he's happy about a woman who saw this video in a church, went and looked at some of his material and started doubting the existence of God now. And I think that is his trick.
So was part of that trick somehow getting them to use his video without permission? His trick counted on ministers taking a video on the internet from a known atheist and spontaneously using it without even informing him they were doing it? How does that make any sense? Didn't these preachers watch the video before they showed it? Did someone trick them into playing it? Did someone sneak into their church's AV booth and load it up? No. These preachers saw an atheist appreciate the gift of a Bible and decided, completely on their own, to work it into their services.
To some people, he would appear to be giving a nice, honest, open argument.
And that's exactly what he's doing.
But what you're saying is that there is something deeper behind that people really should spot if they just stop and think.
But the problem is, in this case, they are stopping to think. And that's what you don't like, is it? The fact that your hideous and bigoted lies about atheists are being exposed for all the world to see.
And what he does, he gets this into the churches, makes it look like he's a friendly fellow, but then he slides in there is no God. He makes a definitive statement. So people start to like him, people start to cozy up to what he's saying, and then he throws in this, there is no God, and I think that he wants to seed doubt into them.
This was not made for churches. Penn did nothing to get it into churches, and neither did Sony. It was a fairly typical edition of Penn Says, and ministers used it on their own. Penn did absolutely nothing to make it happen. This was their act of taking his video off the internet and showing it in their church. How is that his trick? This just goes to show the depths of dishonesty that these guys will go to in order to denigrate someone who's just stating his opinion, while showing appreciation for theirs. They can't stand that, because their opinion cannot stand up to any kind of scrutiny, so the only response they have to this is to tell incredible lies and spin the facts so much that there's no way they couldn't be this week's biggest Bogon emitter. Now it's time to protect our precious recipients from this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. Texas Governor Rick Perry is someone who could have won this requital many times in the past, including last April when he declared a 3-day statewide period of prayer for rain before one of the largest droughts in the state's history. But after not only being governor of Texas, but seeking the Republican Party's nomination for president, it's pretty sad when you come out and say something like this.
And, it's a theory that is out there, and it's got some gaps in it. But in Texas, we teach both creationism and evolution in our public school.
Okay, so I could spend a lot of time here exposing his embarrassing ignorance of science, but instead, I'll put all of that aside to focus on another piece of his astounding ignorance. As this podcast reported last month, not only does the state of Texas not teach both creation and evolution, but a recent ploy to try and sneak in creationist material failed, unanimously. So even putting his ignorance of science aside, his ignorance of the law, as well as his complete cluelessness about what schools in his own state are teaching, shows that he can't possibly have the level of awareness necessary for the office of president. If he doesn't even understand his own state's education policy, putting him in an office that claims power over the entire nation's education seems like a very bad idea to me. He is not competent to be president, not even competent to be Texas's governor, and really isn't appropriate for any kind of title at all, except, of course, for the title of Idiot Extraordinaire. Well, that wraps up this perspicacious edition of the Bogosity podcast. Please visit the forums at bogosity.tv, where you can read the show notes and participate in discussions about these subjects and anything else you like. And if you'd like to participate in the Bogosity podcast, you can send a question, statement, news article, or rant to podcast@bogosity.tv. If you put it in an MP3 file, it just might get played in the podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from Hermann Göring. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same way in any country. The Bogosity podcast is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 3.0 Unported license.
Bogosity.